It's good to see each one this evening. And Brother Hopper had assured me that he had prepared you for the material that we're presenting this week. Not exactly like what we presented this morning. I prefer preaching from God's Word. We have a lot of people who've been convinced by science that the Word is not the truth. And I get opportunity from time to time to speak on college campuses, and there we speak with the scientists and with those who will allow science to be presented, and we can do that and present evidence from science to show that the Bible is the Word of God. And so we'll be dealing with science this week, and perhaps some longer sessions than you normally would be having. I think you were given warning on that. And then we are planning a question period immediately following. We'll conclude with an invitation and then hope that you have some questions. And we'll spend maybe 10 to 15 minutes with questions. This evening we're talking about the subject of creation science and raising the question, what is creation science? That's a critical issue because it is so consistently distorted by a misinformed media and sometimes judges that have a liberal agenda opposed to faith in God. They just don't tell the truth. Never heard of that with the media, have you? That's definitely the case with creation science. And what is creation science in particular? Let me give you an illustration of what is typically presented from the American Institute of Biological Sciences. Because creationism is based almost solely on religious dogma, and they wouldn't say evolutionism typically, but it's creationism, which gives it that religious flavor, is based almost solely on religious dogma stemming from faith rather than demonstrable facts. It does not lend itself to the scientific process. This is the propaganda that is presented by the media. I think before we're finished this evening, you'll know that that's not the case when we're dealing with creation science. We're dealing with the scientific data. We are dealing with the demonstrable facts. Well, how do you look at the facts and distinguish between creation and evolution? By just looking at the facts as opposed to what the Bible says. Well, we can easily illustrate the answer to that. We look at this rock and I ask, how did it originate? Where did the shape come from? And you would probably say time and chance would produce a shape like this. But then we look at another rock and where did that come from? I think obviously people would say this is intelligent design. Now, this is a demonstrable fact. That is not a religious conclusion, is it? Do we have to throw away science and relegate this to the classroom because we have reached the idea that this is intelligently designed? No, we're simply looking at the facts. And that's what I think we need in our classrooms today, all of the facts, but they are not presented. Another illustration. We're walking down the beach and we see the lines that parallel the waves, and we raise the question, where and how did that form? Did somebody do that, or did this just happen naturally? Well, we look a little closer and examine it carefully, and I think we would conclude this is a natural result of the wave process. But then you walk a little bit further down the beach and you see John loves Mary. And you think, yeah, the waves probably did that. Or do you? No, you know better than that. This involves information, and we know that information indicates that there's been intelligence involved. And Are we involved in a religious conclusion there? Or is this purely natural? Is this a scientific process? Nothing religious about that. That is a scientific conclusion. When we see things that result from intelligence, we conclude that it was not natural. Now, that is the process that is totally appropriate in the classroom, that if we examine all the evidence, well, let's just do that and see where it leads. We look, for example, at this fly and look at the wings. It's got ants on its wing. How did that happen? Well, maybe there was a bottle of ink that tipped over and just caused this ant to appear on the wing. Probably not likely, is it? Looks a little more designed than that. Somebody drew the ant on the wing, or at least there's design indicated there, right? But then we look at an actual fly that lives in the Middle East, this one from the Arab Emirate Republic, and this is the way it grows. 6 legs, differentiated head, tail, thorax, eyes, drawn, it would appear, on the wings. How did that get there? Well, you can make all kinds of imaginative guesses, but what we see is that this appears on all of the wings of this fly, and that's, I don't think, the process of just an accident. I think that's obviously designed. We look at arrowheads, we look at John Loves Mary, and we say that was designed. And why wouldn't we reach the same conclusion about the ants on the wing? Some of you are familiar with origami. We had a lady in Hot Springs that was just really good at it, very bright lady. That doesn't happen when you just wad up the paper and throw it in the trash can, does it? Somebody's done some head scratching and figured out how to do that. Well, we look at some leaves that look like they've been folded in a way that looks like a hummingbird, and that is the way it grows in northern Australia. You look in the background, and well, let's look at a closer view. You can see just a dramatic indication, I think, of design. And if you watch close, you can see some other things designed, I think, flying in and flying out. But how do you account for this? And are we involved in a religious discussion? It has some religious implications, I think, but this is a scientific process, and the best explanation for that is design. I don't think there's a rational way to account for that otherwise. And it gets worse as we see more obvious intellect implied. We see machinery in living things, designed machinery. The tail on the back of the bacteria, the bacterial flagellum as it's called, whirls around like an outboard motor and propels the bacteria through a liquid medium. Here's the description from science. Bacterial flagellum, a rotary nanomotor, means little bitty motor, that allows the bacteria to propel themselves through liquids, a machine that self-assembles on the nanoscale. Where do machines come from? Grow on trees? Not usually, or just you throw junk up and they come down as machines. Somebody's put some head scratching in there and some intellect, engineers at work. These things have rotors. It's an electric motor, stator, O-rings. They have bushings and U-joints and a drive shaft, and turn at 100,000 revolutions per minute. Brother Hooper, what would happen if one of your automobile engines turned at 100,000 revolutions per minute? You'd have parts in all directions. Get up to 10,000, it's gone that far. That's amazing. And this thing can reverse and go in the opposite direction within a quarter turn. It just zips along, and we can't build something like that. It has over 30 coordinated parts, all essential, each one. If you don't have the rotor, the O-rings are not going to help you. And if you got O-rings, you got to have the drive shaft. All of that is necessary in order for that to function. It is, as science says, a machine that self-assembles. And we think of that in terms of what Darwin said about a test to his theory. If it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed under numerous successive slight modifications, one step, another step, another step, if that can't account for it, he says my theory would absolutely break down. Well, you can't get the O-rings and then wait a few thousand years to get the bushings. You've got to have it all or nothing works. And that is exactly what Darwin said would cause his theory to break down. Now, when we observe machines, what we observe, and that's what science is about, is that they are designed. You can imagine another source, but that's not science. Science is what we observe. Therefore, design is the scientific explanation for this kind of a machinery that operates even better than our own electric motors that we design. That's creation science. We're seeing if this can be explained naturally or by intelligence. One of the most obvious examples, I think, would be from what was published fairly recently, 2018, in one of the journals of Nature, Cell Systems. Yeast, and that's one of the simplest things we know about, has been subjected to the most comprehensive analysis yet. They've looked at it pretty close before, but now then, this is the most comprehensive analysis. It's similar to the bacteria in size, but this yeast cell has how many molecules? A measurement of the absolute molecules per cell. Would you guess how many? You'd probably guess 210 trillion molecules. Probably not. And these are not just molecules jumbled around in there. They're organized into proteins, which are actually machines. 42 million proteins in the single little yeast cell, described in the article as machines, spinning to and fro, turning about various axes, not 100,000 revolutions per minute, which is amazing, 1 million rotations per second. Per second. Whoa. That's mind-boggling. And there are 42 million of these machines doing this, and they're all working together, functioning as a single cell. 42 million machines or proteins, like the machines invented by humans. These protein assemblies contain highly coordinated moving parts. Now, if that doesn't boggle your mind, it's just not boggleable. That's something not going to happen by itself. We certainly don't see that kind of thing happening, or even close. And science is about what we see, right? You can imagine, but that's not science. How do you get this kind of machinery without intelligence? Well, that's a challenge. Michael Roos is one of the leading philosophers of science in our country, director of history and philosophy of science at Florida State now. He was being interviewed by Ben Stein, and he asked him the question now, how are you going to come up with this kind of machinery just naturally? And that's our sound that ought to be coming through here. heard him say it. He basically says, well, how do you get some mud turning into something living? And he says, well, maybe it was molecules riding on the backs of crystals. And crystals have mistakes every once in a while, and so the molecule rides on the back of it, and it picks up that kind of order. Do we know where our problem is, or can we fix it? I'm sorry. We'll apologize for that. It worked great this morning. But we think about this, and he's been working over there in Africa, and ancient man chipped some of the rocks, and you could see it was made into a tool, and this rock chip indicates this is done by intelligence. It's shaped, it's a prehistoric tool. Okay, and we can agree with him. That's indication of intelligent design. But on the other hand, he sees the yeast cell, 42 million machines at 1 million rotations per second, and there's no intelligent design. Does that make sense? No intelligent design here. There is intelligent design there. I think that's just nuts. That's just blindness, refusing to look. Interestingly, some of the leading scientists will acknowledge, yes, this looks designed. Richard Dawkins of Oxford is one of the leading proponents of evolution today, and he defines biology this way: the study of complicated things that have the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Now, he didn't believe a word of it. He's an atheist. But it looks that way. But you have to remember that's not the case. It happened with natural selection. Francis Crick, Nobel laureate, describer of DNA, says biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed but rather evolved, because it looks like it was. But you have to work on this. Don't go there. You have to put your blinders on, is the way I would put it, to make sure you don't do that, because you just can't look that way and be a scientist. That's the way they do science. So in the classroom today, we could talk about that nanomotor turning into 100,000 revolutions per minute, but no, you can't do that. So there's no intelligent design that's allowed as an explanation in the classroom. Yeah, it looks that way, but you can't describe it as intelligence. And they don't allow that. I don't think that's good science. I don't think that's appropriate. I think both creation and evolution can be investigated scientifically. I think we can demonstrate that. When we look at the evidence, that's what we see. The alternatives, we'll talk about molecules riding on the backs of crystals. You don't see that. In contrast to what you see, I think you have much better scientific explanation. Both of them have religious implications. Sometimes we'll say, well, evolution can be in the classroom because it's science, and creation has religious implications, so it can't. That's a very naive approach. Both have profound religious implications. I've got another sound clip coming. I'm getting the approval back there. Dawkins, I think, explains the fact that you just really can't deny the religious implications.
So was there a defining moment where you made a decision that you didn't believe in God? Or?
Yes, I suppose I switched from Christian theism to some sort of deism round about the age of 14 or 15, and then switched to atheism round about the age of 15, 16.
And was there a particular point or something that you read or an experience you had that sort of said, yeah, this is it, God doesn't exist?
Oh, well, by far the most important, I suppose, was understanding evolution. I think the evangelical Christians have really sort of got it right in a way in seeing evolution as the enemy, whereas the more, what shall we say, sophisticated theologians who are quite happy to live with evolution. I think they're deluded, and I think the evangelicals have got it right in that there really is a deep incompatibility between evolution and Christianity, and I think I realized that at the age of about 16.
Try to say, well, one's religious, the other isn't. We can have one in the classroom. We can't have the other. That's just not the case. Notice the statement by Isaac Asimov, who's one of the more famous evolutionary atheists. He says, I have faith and belief myself. I believe that nothing beyond those natural laws is needed. I have no evidence of this. It's simply what I have faith in and what I believe. One's scientific, the other's religious. That's just not true. They have great faith, and it's amazing how much faith the unbelievers have to have. They believe that nothing created everything, and that a big explosion produced the entire universe, and that molecules self-assemble and become living cells, and errors in information produce more information. That's just amazing faith. The unbeliever believes there was nothing, and then nothing happened to nothing. Nothing magically exploded, creating everything, and a bunch of everything magically rearranged itself for no reason into molecules, which turned into dinosaurs and eventually into people. You buy that? That's the faith of the naturalistic evolutionist, and it has practical implications, as does religion. Here's the book. One of the authors is Michael Roos, that we almost listened to a moment ago. Evolutionary Ethics. Where does that lead? Well, we'll let Jerry Remkin tell us that. He's the author of the Green New Deal. We no longer feel ourselves to be guests in someone else's home, therefore obligated to make our behavior conform to a set of pre-existing cosmic rules. If we're evolutionists, we don't believe in God, so we don't have to conform to the rules. It's our creation now. We make the rules. We no longer have to justify our behavior, for we're now architects of the universe. We're responsible for nothing outside ourselves. We are the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever and ever. But see, there are no religious implications here, which is foolish. Obviously, both have profound religious implications. But we're told, isn't everything else in school illegal except evolution? And that simply isn't the case. Ruled on by the Supreme Court. Here's a decision that was made, Edwards versus Willard. Brennan gave the majority opinion. The act, and this was an act that said you have to present both sides. If you present one, present the other. We talked some about that. And they turned it down and ruled it unconstitutional, but here's the reason. The act does not grant teachers a flexibility they did not already possess. To supplant the present science curriculum with the presentation of theories besides evolution about the origin of life. Teaching a variety of scientific theories about the origin of humankind to school children might be validly done with a clear secular intent of enhancing the effectiveness of science education. You can teach alternatives to evolution according to the Supreme Court. And so because you already have that right, they turned down the law that said you have to. Stephen Gould, again, a very representative evolutionist from Harvard, was asked about teaching creation science in the schools. He said, no statute exists in any state to bar instruction in creation science. It could be taught before, it can be taught now. Now, we can't teach Genesis as science, but we can teach the kind of things we've been teaching you here in the last few minutes. In spite of the propaganda, many believe that it's illegal to teach this in the schools. They can't teach creation science. In spite of that propaganda, I think we can say clearly the truth is winning. A Gallup poll conducted 2019 regarding intelligent design, 40% believe God created humans in their present form, only 33% believe God guided the evolution, and 22% believed in naturalistic evolution of humans. Now that's what's taught in the schools exclusively. 22% agreed. We have the majority of the opinion, but we're the ones who have to shut up while they talk, and I don't think that's appropriate. Another interesting poll was conducted nationwide, testing this proposition. Teachers and students should have the academic freedom to objectively discuss both the scientific strengths and weaknesses of the theory of evolution. 93% agreed with that. It's important for policymakers and the public to hear scientists with differing views. 94% agreed, but that's not allowed in most of the classrooms. A very interesting article appeared back in 2001, quoting from 100 very prominent leading scientists, appeared in New Republic. We're skeptical of the claims for the ability of random mutations, natural selection to account for the complexity of life. They doubt Darwinism, and here are their names from the prestigious institutions across the country. There were 100 that signed that. Now then, there are well over 1,000 that added their name to it, all with doctorates in the natural sciences, include scientists from U.S. Academy of Sciences, from the Russian, Polish, Czech national academies, from universities such as Yale, Princeton, Harvard, Stanford, MIT, Columbia, Purdue, Berkeley, UCLA, Duke, Cambridge, Oxford, and yes, University of Arkansas, who have signed that saying, we don't believe Darwinism will explain life. And just recently, even more prominent scientists have joined. Here's the Nobel Prize winner of physics from Cambridge University, who made the statement 2021, less than a year ago, referring to a new book, The Return of the God Hypothesis. This book makes it clear that far from being an unscientific claim, intelligent design is valid science. And so the idea that you have to be ignorant to believe this is just lying propaganda. And we do see that. Here's Ernst Mayr from Harvard, who says no educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution. That ain't so. And we just demonstrated that it's not so. We know that's a simple fact, and we also know some people don't know what facts are and don't concern themselves with facts. Some have just abandoned trying to deal with the evidence, and Richard Dawkins would be in that category. He advocates this approach. He says, go beyond humorous ridicule. This is published recently on his website. Sharpen our barbs to a point where they really hurt. I think they're likely to be swayed by a display of naked contempt. Nobody likes to be laughed at. Nobody wants to be the butt of contempt. That's not the way science proceeds, but that is what is being advocated today. One good example of that, Professor P.Z. Myers, University of Minnesota. His website is probably read by more evolutionists than any other in the world. He's leading the battle, and he refers to creationists as theocrats, faith healers, and snake oil artists. We won't quote all that he says. Get rid of the polite words, careful rhetoric. It's time for the scientists to break out the steel-toed boots, brass knuckles, get out there and hammer the lunatics and idiots. This is supposed to be science, and this is what they're advocating publicly. One of the better known advocates, in fact, he got after me fairly recently. Here's an example of the bad guys, Don Patton, preening smarmily. I didn't know I knew how to do that. What in the world is smarmily? I had to look that up. Extremely polite in a way that's annoying. Okay, that's all right. That's what I was trying to do. Accusing Darwinism of failing. He can quote biologists from Darwin to Eldridge, and yeah, I plead guilty to that. Darwin's view, I think, is much more reasonable. He says, in the origin of species, a fair result can only be obtained by balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question. I find myself very much in agreement with that, though they tried that and it didn't work. One of the important things in defining creation science is defining the terms that we're talking about, because terms get, don't you believe in evolution is just change, Dr. Patton? Don't you believe? I said, well, yes, I believe in change. I've got some in my pocket, but I think we need to define our terms if we're going to have a reasonable conversation about it. There's a difference between what's called micro and macro evolution. That's the little bitty variations as opposed to the big major changes. I would call the micro changes, which is normally what they're talking about when they point to evidence in the textbook, as horizontal variation within the kind. We look at dogs, for example, all the same species, but they vary, and you can produce these variations within a relatively short period of time, but that's not what we're talking about. Variations we predict. I think the Creator would predictably create similar forms for similar functions and create variation to adapt to various circumstances to allow the species to survive. But macro, big changes, is different, and that is the idea that all came from a common ancestor and all of these small ones added up to the big ones. It's a change from one kind to another kind entirely, and that is the issue, and that's normally not what they're talking about. Just defining what we're talking about helps immensely. Horizontal variation within the kind, that's not the issue. But a change from one kind to another, all coming from a common ancestor, that's very, very different. We need to proceed not by just seeing who can call the other the worst names or yell the loudest, but with the scientific method, usually attributed to Francis Bacon, who, by the way, was a very devout creationist, came up with what's called the scientific method. There are a number of variations, but basically involve 4 points. It has to be observable, repeatable, experimental. You need to be able to do experiments to demonstrate it, and then it must be falsifiable. That is, set up tests so that if this happens, it's verified. If this happens, it's falsified. If you can't test it, then it's not really science. It must meet those 4 criteria to be proved scientifically. Well, let's evaluate evolution for those 4 points, beginning with observable. Well, there's observation in the living world, and G. Leonard Stubbins comments on that. He's from Harvard, a very famous biologist. He said, the reason the major steps of evolution have never been observed is they require millions of years. Okay, if they require millions of years, you don't observe it. But that's the first criteria. You need to observe it, and he says you can't. Well, in the fossil record, you do cover the millions of years, and maybe we can observe it over the millions of years from the fossil record. We'll talk more about that later in the week. Stephen Gould of Harvard says the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persist as the trade secret of paleontologists. We view our data as so bad we never see the very process we profess to say. We don't see it in the fossil record either. He says it went too fast to be recorded in the fossil record, so you don't see it in the living world, you don't see it in the fossil record. Well, what about the experimental processes. Jerry Cohn, again, a very famous antagonistic evolutionist, anti-creationist, professor of biology at the University of Chicago. Evolutionary biology is historical science. Unlike the hard science, you cannot resolve issues with simple experiments. It happened in the past. Very recent article here, 2021, when asked what science is and how it functions, scientists say the essence of science is controlled, repeatable experiment. Forgetting experiments are of relatively little importance in cosmology and evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology is about things in the past. You can't do experiments that way, as they acknowledge. And can you test it? Well, Colin Patterson's making a similar point. He's curator, or was at this time, of the largest fossil museum in the world, British Museum of Natural History. He said, and he's talking about the change from ape man to man, Australopithecus to man. We'll talk about that, I believe, Friday. It's unique and unrepeatable, like the history of England. Unique events are by definition not a part of science. They are unrepeatable, not subject to test. All 4 points, they just fall flat on their face. That's what you have to do to be scientifically proved, and they can't do any of that. Which is also true about creation. You can't observe the creation. You can't do experiments to test it. So the truth is, neither are subject to absolute scientific proof, the scientific method. I think both of them can be examined scientifically, as we've demonstrated, just looking at the arrowheads and the various indications. The approach when we don't observe directly is model comparison, and sometimes it's referred to as the principle of parsimony. We look at the evidence that we can see, biology, microbiology, physics, geology, and we compare the two models, which one fits best. Now, we're not observing the thing directly, but here's what we can observe and which one fits best. The principle is Occam's razor, or parsimony is another way of saying which one fits better. And so that's the proper method when you don't observe directly, and it doesn't result in proof, but the probabilistic, likely superior model. All right, which model is better at explaining what Darwin saw? We got our G there in the wrong place, but we understand. Darwin sailed around the world as naturalist on the Beetle, the boat that took them to the Galapagos Islands that we see illustrated here, and there he saw some pretty strange animals he hadn't seen in England, and was thinking about how this originated, how they got to be different, and particularly he talked about the finches, and you see this in all the biology textbooks, the variety of finches. He didn't really reach his conclusion about the finches for another 2 years after he got back home. But he looked at the beaks, and okay, some of them are bigger and some of them are smaller, and the big ones are better for breaking the seeds when they don't have the trees. The trees would hold the beetles and the bugs, and the little bitty beaks could reach in and get those, and so the little bitty beaks did better with islands with trees, and the other islands didn't have the trees. The big beaks were better. So he saw evidence for micro change, not from a finch to an eagle or to a different species, like dogs with different spots and larger and smaller, but still the same species. That he saw evidence for at best, though wasn't as good as was represented, as we'll see. He saw no evidence for microevolution, a change from one kind to another kind. But this is what's in the textbooks. And why do they put that in the textbooks? they had something better, they'd do it. That's what they have. We see this recently. Darwin's finches evolved before scientists' eyes. Okay, now this is what we need if we're going to have proof, and this is what's in the textbooks. For the first time, scientists have observed, now this is the first time it happened, and that was 2006. That's amazing. Different point. For the first time, scientists have observed in real time evolutionary changes in one species driven by competition for resources. All right, that sounds like what Darwin predicted, and now then they have seen it. Well, but then you look at the rest of the story. What the change they're talking about is a change of less than 1 millimeter in beak size. A little bit of change in the size of the beak. That doesn't make it a different critter at all. And actually, they didn't even observe that change because that much variation was already there. But with a drought, there was a selection for the smaller beak size, and so there were more that had the smaller beak size than had the larger beak size. So it didn't change, it just changed the relative numbers in the population. That's Darwin's finches evolving before your eyes. And that's the best they've got. And that, the speciation that is supposed to be represented in the textbooks, according to nature, has now been undone, as we're told that these finches, which used to be 14, different ones have collapsed down into 2. You've seen that in the textbooks? I don't think so. You've still got the 14 different kinds. Not 14 species, but down to 2, which says this is a reversible change. It goes this way, and it goes that way, and it comes back, and it goes depending on whether there's a drought or not. But that's not change from one kind to another kind. That's horizontal variation. That's reversible. But they continue to propagandize this kind of evidence. Here in 2018, the birds are evolutionary biologists' most celebrated example of natural selection in action. That's the best they got. A variation of a few millimeters of beak size. When we think about that, and think about what Darwin saw in evaluating the models, I think we need to also think about what he didn't see. Darwin didn't see a bird dog, did he? Or a cow bird, or any of the things that we see represented here. He saw the very minimal change that wasn't a change from one kind to another kind, but we look at that and we snicker and we think, that's funny. Why? Because we know good well that's not happening. What we do see is the variation in finches like we see in dogs that doesn't produce anything new. It's horizontal variation within the kind, and that's not at issue. Another example of what Darwin saw in all of the biology textbooks involves the pepper moths, represented here as it was in England before the Industrial Revolution, with the light-colored trunks not covered with soot, and the black ones stood out. The light ones were pretty much camouflaged, but they were light and dark before. And then with the Industrial Revolution putting soot all over the trees, now the black ones are camouflaged, the light ones stick out. You got light and dark before, and you got light and dark afterward, but they change in the relative numbers because theoretically the birds come along and eat the ones that are showing up, and they eat more of the ones that are more obvious. So you got light and dark before and light and dark afterwards. That's the kind of evidence you see in the textbook. What Darwin saw, how does that fit? Does that show evolution? Interestingly, Harrison Matthews, who was considered the most prominent biologist in England when Darwin's Centennial Edition was published, he was chosen to write the introduction to the Centennial Edition. And in it, he said the pepper moths experiments do not show evolution in progress. For however the population may alter, the moths remain from beginning to end Biston bacillarius. It's the same species, light and dark before, light and dark afterwards. But that's not the way it's presented in the textbooks. Here in the International Wildlife Encyclopedia, it's the most striking evolutionary change ever witnessed by man. And you know what? I think they're right. I think that's the best they got. That's not microevolution, which is the issue. And even that's been discredited. Jerry Cohn, the anti-creationist, University of Chicago, wrote in Nature saying the most serious problem in that Biston bacillarius probably doesn't rest on tree trunks. Now, I've seen thousands of them on tree trunks in the biology textbooks. But that's not where, in two moths have been seen in such a position more than 40 years of intensive research. 40 years, they've seen 2. But that's in all of the textbooks. And here it's still taught, 2011 in Science, peppered moth, Biston bacillarius, is the most widely recognized example of contemporary evolutionary change. American Biology Teacher, 2020, here it is on the front page. That's the best. Now, with our model comparison, we're saying here's what Darwin saw. Let's look at what he saw and which model fits. There's no change that would begin to be macroevolution. It's all about the little bitty changes. It's a relative shift in the numbers of horizontal variations. And that's not what they need to prove their point. Darwin observed these small variations that go back and forth, that don't add up and accumulate, and assumed that the small changes would add up to the big unobserved changes. He didn't see that, but assumed that that would be the case. That's not science. But we can test that assumption. No, you can't test it. It takes millions of years. Well, in some cases you can. When you look at things that reproduce rapidly, when we see things that do produce observed millions of generations, like fruit flies and like bacteria, and what happens? Well, they don't change. They stay the same. Michael DeSole, writing in the Encyclopedia of Life Sciences, refers to the fruit flies, and we've done terrible things to these little fruit flies. We subjected them to all kind of mutagenic chemicals and radiation and pulled their wings off, and no wonder PETA hadn't had a fit about some of the experiments with our fruit flies. But if mutation were a variation of value to the species, then evolution of Drosophila should have proceeded with extreme rapidity. The facts entirely contradict the validity of this theoretical deduction. We have seen Drosophila type has not been modified in any way, and that's since the early 1900s, reproducing every 2 weeks, a new generation, millions observed, and they're still fruit flies. Some of them kind of weird without wings and different color eyes, not very well suited to survive, but fruit flies. Likewise with bacteria, which reproduce rapidly, every 20 minutes a new generation sometimes. Bacterial populations do not progress beyond certain boundaries, according to Warner Braun, leading authority in bacterial genetics. Boundaries to variation. We see variation, but boundaries to that variation. Interestingly, here they describe some fossil bacteria, just like bacteria that we see today, look the same as the bacteria in the same region from 2.3 billion years ago. I don't buy their ages, but let's play the game their way and see how it comes out. Both sets of ancient bacteria are indistinguishable from modern sulfur bacteria. Here's the fossil, here's the living, and it's identical. We've got another way to test it. When we look at critters that are caught in the amber, supposedly 200 million years ago, and here's 356 different animals over 200 million years ago. Okay, now that to show us some differences. Here from National Geographic News, surprisingly, these microscopic organisms look quite familiar to today's scientists. They have undergone few or no physical changes. You can test it. It takes millions of years. Well, yes, you can. You look at the finches, you look at the bacteria, the fruit flies, you look at the animal inclusions in the amber, and you see where's the change. We see variation, but micro change. We also see barriers to that variation, and they don't explain that. Eugene Koonin pretty well sums up, and he's one of the more recent leading authorities here from the National Health Association, senior investigator. He says the traditional concept of the tree of life is gone. And in our handout, you'll see the full quote. He says natural selection, the main driving force of evolution, that's gone. We've shown that that's not the case. This is published in Trends in Genetics. And he's probably the leading authority. He's talking about textbook evolution, and it's gone. The modern synthesis, that's the synthesis of Mendelian genetics and Darwinian natural selection. You put that together, that's the modern theory of evolution. It's crumbled, apparently beyond repair. Not to mince words, the modern synthesis is gone. Now, that's not what they tell you in the textbooks. Just fairly recently here, less than a year ago, it's referred to survival of the fittest. Does not accurately represent the dynamics of evolutionary process. Here in the editorial of the official journal of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, less than a year ago, survival of the fittest does not accurately represent the dynamics of evolutionary process. So the biology teacher don't know about that. But the leading authorities will say that's the way it is. Now, let's evaluate which explains the facts best. We look at things like the bacterial flagellum, the 42 million machines in the simple cell. Intelligence explains information, and that's what we're seeing. We can explain that, intelligent design, whereas evolution, where's the information come from? Got no explanation for that. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow evening. Which model works best? We look at the fact that you have variation, but you have boundaries to that variation, and that's what there are two observations. They only look at one. They can see not both explained, but one, just the variations, and half explained, and the variation that's supposed to add up the processes, natural selection, survival of the fittest, that's gone. Now, which model works best? This is the way you do science. You look at the data, you evaluate, you see which one fits best. Now, what we're doing tonight, remember, is not showing you the best evidence for creation, but defining creation science. Remember? That's what we set out to do. Now then, when you listen to what we did tonight, you know what creation science is. Natural history says, here's creation science. Creationists seek to impose onto the population at large by political means a body of religious beliefs derived from the literal reading of the King James Version of the Holy Bible, both the Old and New Testament. Is that what you heard tonight? Or did you see someone evaluating the scientific data? They're not telling the truth. And why do they do that? Well, they can't stand toe-to-toe with us when you evaluate the scientific data, so they just say it's all religious garbage and won't talk about it. Creation science evaluates the scientific data. And as we have pointed out, that's really not what we're trying to do tonight, but trying to show you what it is. And maybe you didn't know before, but you know now what creation science is. And it's an evaluation of the scientific data, no matter what the tales are told. If you think we showed that it's superior, good, but you hadn't seen anything yet. We're just getting started. Come back tomorrow night and the next nights, and we'll show you some real powerful evidence. If you're here this evening and haven't confessed your faith, we'd encourage you to do that. The revelation which we can defend tells us that you need to confess your faith in Christ, repent of your sins, and be baptized into Him. We'd encourage you to do that as we stand together and sing the invitation song.